Hi folks, this is Karim Rao from Auto Visualizer channel. We will continue our lab. Our lab is the video number 41. We have been discussing in the previous video the following. We have been continue working with securing Windows Server 2019 based on the recommendations of the Department of Defense and the Defense Information System Agency of the United States. This is the part number 11. We have been working now for 10 videos how to secure Windows Server 2019. We have discussed a lot of concepts to secure Windows Server. Some of them related to services on Windows Server, some are related to users on Windows Server, some are related to policies or password policies, and a lot of things actually, and all of these are to secure your Windows Server 2019. I have to say a note: these recommendations are very secure and very restrictive because they are used by the Department of Defense. So some of these policies may not fit you or with your organizational needs. So you need to test them carefully and see what suits you. Okay, so let's continue from where we have ended the last time. Here we have stopped at Windows Server 2019 Corpus login restrictions must be enforced. Here let's say the explanation. This policy setting determined whether the Corpus, it is a protocol used to authenticate a user to the domain. So for example, if I have an Active Directory user called Karim and I need to access the domain redaller.internal, as soon as I put my username and password, the Corpus protocol takes this username and password and sends them or transfer them to the domain controller, and then the domain controller verifies that this username or password are correct and then sends them back through the Corpus to the user to allow him to access the machine. This process is encrypted, so sending the username and password from the client to the domain controller, it is sent encrypted, and this is done by the Corpus. Okay, and retrieving or replying to the client that your username and password is correct also is sent encrypted, and it is sent by the Corpus. So the Corpus main function is to authenticate the user to the domain. Okay, and another thing is also to make sure that this user have the appropriate rights to access certain resources on the machine. So for example, if you have for example a folder for example on the machine or a service on the machine, and you need to make sure that this user has the appropriate right to access this folder or this service, this also is done by the Corpus. So the Corpus validates the access to target resources. It is not circumvented or it's not played with, and actually this user have the appropriate rights to access these resources, these local resources or local services on the machine. So we can have a little bit of explanation here. Here we can see that the Corpus issues something called a ticket, something called, or two type of tickets: ticket granting ticket and service tickets. Service tickets are obtained from the target granting service. First of all, what is the ticket granting service? It is used to authenticate the identity of a particular entity in the Active Directory, such as a user account. So the TGT, this is a ticket issued by the Corpus, and it is given to the user after he is authenticated to the domain. So for example, here we can see, for example, a user called Smith. He is requesting to access the domain by sending this request to the domain controller. This is done by the Corpus, and then the Corpus, after authenticating that the username and password are correct, will send a reply that he can access the domain. Okay, so the sending and reply, this is done by the Corpus. As soon as the Corpus verifies that this user is correct and he has a correct username and password, he will authenticate the user to access the domain. Okay, and for example, if this user needs to access, for example, a SQL server on the domain controller, for example, this is called the service ticket. So if, for example, now the user is granted TGT or a ticket granting ticket, this ticket it's something like it allows him to access the domain. So he is now given the permission to access the domain by issuing something called TGT, and this is done by the Corpus. So the Corpus takes the username and the password and then send it to the domain controller, and then after the domain controller verifies that this username and password is correct, he sends or he approves the user to access the domain and to access the machine, and then gives him a ticket. These tickets allow him to access the domain anytime, so or until a certain time, of course, but he is giving TGT to access the domain or to authorize him to access the domain. Okay, and after that, if he needs to access a certain service on a certain server in the domain, he need to request something called service ticket. So for example, the same user need to access for example a SQL server service, so he need to send a request, okay, to the SQL server, and the SQL server needs to verify that he has appropriate rights to access the SQL server, and then after he verifies that, he send him an approval to access the SQL server. This is called service ticket, and also this is done by the Corpus. So the Corpus has two objectives or two jobs. First of all, to verify that the user have a valid username and password on the domain, and this is called authentication. And the other one is also to verify that the user have the appropriate right to access certain services and folders on the domain or locally on the machine. So this is done by the Corpus. So here what I'm talking about, he's saying that you need to make sure that the Corpus user login restrictions must be enforced. Again, he's saying that every time the Corpus validates every request for a session ticket, this could be or he's especially talking about the service ticket. So every time the Corpus need to validate that the user, if he is asking a service ticket to access a certain service or a certain folder, he need to verify that he already have the right to access or the permission to access this folder or this service on the target machine. By default, the Corpus user login restrictions are enabled, and this is the most secure setting for validating that access to target resources is not circumvented or not manipulated with. So this is already done. We need to make sure only that this group policy is applied, and actually it is only applied to the domain controller. So we need to make sure that this group policy is applied. Okay, it's applied to, he's saying here, to the default domain policy. So he's saying here this should be applied to the default domain policy. Okay, we need to make sure that it is already there, so we can check and see if this is applied in the default domain policy. We go to Windows setting, so we need to go to our console and then access the default domain policy, and this is enabled by default, so you don't need to enable it, but we need to make sure it is already enabled. Sorry guys. Then we go to the Windows setting, okay, and then we need to go to security setting and then to go to the Corpus policy, account policies, then Corpus policy. We need to make sure enforce user login restrictions it is already enabled. So this is a good thing to know. And then we need to continue working with the other recommendations. He's saying that service ticket maximum lifetime must be limited to 600 minutes or less. So this we are talking about the service ticket. It is the ticket given to the user to access a particular service or a particular folder. Okay, this setting determines the maximum amount of time that are granted a session ticket can be used to access a particular service. So for example, as we said before, for example, if a user try to access the SQL server service in our domain, he should given something called a service ticket. Okay, so he will be allowed to access the SQL server for 600 minutes, okay, based on the service ticket time. And after that, this service ticket could be renewed or could be renewed or could be not renewed. So he's saying that this setting determines the maximum amount of time that is granted a session ticket can be used to access a particular service. Session tickets are used only to authenticate new connections with servers. Outgoing operations are not interrupted if the session ticket used to authenticate the connection expires during the connection. So saying that the outgoing operations, so for example if the service ticket is expired, this will not affect the outgoing operations, okay, the outgoing operations to the client, okay, but it will affect the incoming to the server, okay. So anyway, this is a group policy. We need to make sure that the service ticket issued by the Corpus, it's limited only to 600 minutes. We have seen this in the graph. Again, I can show you here. So for example, on the explanation here, if for example a certain user tries to access the Sysvol server on our domain, he will be granted a service ticket. This ticket will last for 600 minutes. So this is what we are talking about. We need to make some time or verify the time a service ticket should last, and this is very critical, because the less time, the more secure the service ticket will be. So the less time the service ticket expires in, the more it is secure. So for example, if I make a service ticket maximum time to be, for example, maybe 2 hours, 600 minutes, I think this is more than, maybe, for example, if 1 day or 2 days, this is not secure as, for example, making the service ticket 1 day. Okay, anyway, so the less the more secure. So we need to check the Corpus service ticket maximum lifetime. It should be 600 minutes. So this is also done by default. If you see the default, we will see it the maximum to 600. If you go there and see the default domain policy, again we will see that the Corpus maximum service ticket time will be 600 minutes. So here let's go to security and then go to accounts and then Corpus. Here maximum lifetime for service ticket will be 600 minutes. This is it. Let's go to the next recommendation. So the next recommendation is here we have done already the 600 minutes. So here this is the user ticket lifetime must be limited to 10 hours or less. So we have said before that the Corpus have two types of tickets. One is the TGT, and this is given to the user when he is authenticated or when he is verified that he has a username or a valid username and a password in the domain. And the other one is the service ticket to access certain services on certain servers in the domain or locally on the machine, on a target machine. So he's saying here we have the TGT, we have discussed this, and the service tickets. Corpus have a limited lifetime, so the time Corpus tickets, the TGT and the service tickets, have limited lifetime, so the time an attacker has to implement an attack is limited. Okay, so this policy controls how long TGT can be renewed. Okay, so this is the ticket given to the user, not the ticket of the service. So with Corpus, the user's initial authentication to the domain controller results in a TGT. This is, we have discussed before, which is then used to request service tickets to resources. This is also a very logical thing. So you cannot access services, or you are not given service tickets unless you have a ticket grant ticket, or you should be authenticated first to the domain. You will not access resources to the domain unless you are authenticated to the domain. This is very logic. And then which is then used to request service tickets to resources. Upon startup, each computer gets a TGT before requesting a service ticket. This is very normal. We need to get a TGT, okay, before requesting a service ticket to the domain controller. and any other computers it need to access. So you should issue a service ticket if you need to access resources on the domain controller or any other computer in the domain, okay, or any other resources on any other computers or servers in the domain. For services that start up under a specific user account, users must always get a TGT first and then get service tickets to all computers and services accessed. So we will control the TGT lifetime and the service ticket lifetime. Okay, so this is very basic. We need to make it for 10 hours or less. This is the TGT, and the service ticket should be 600 minutes. So this is very logic, and this controls what the hacker or the time the hacker should work or the time frame he has to access or hack the resources. Okay. So this is very good. This is how we know that the Corpus, or this is how the Corpus works. So now we have the explanation. I have discussed this in the website, and also this documentation clearly states how the Corpus works and what are the tickets granted by the Corpus. Okay, so the Corpus main function is to authenticate or to verify the user or the Active Directory username and password and the rights to access certain resources in the domain. Resources here we mean services or folders. Okay, so this is very good. We need to make sure first of all that we have enforced Corpus login restrictions, and then we need to make the service ticket Corpus lifetime to be 600 minutes and the ticket granting ticket of the Corpus to be 10 hours. Here we see this is already 10 hours. Okay, and it is renewed. Here we can see, for example, another thing, the renewal of the TGT will be after 7 days. So you will be given 10 hours as a lifetime, and then you should request another one, or I think the ticket here, it will be the same ticket will be given for a maximum time, and then the whole ticket will be renewed with a completely new one after 7 days. I think this is it. Anyway, and here we can see one of the things here is the maximum tolerance for computer clock synchronization. We all know that the time or the local time of the machine should be in complete sync or in complete synchronization with the domain controller local time. So if there is any differences, you will not be able to access the domain. How much difference is allowed to access the domain? So for example, if your local machine time is in difference with the domain local time or domain controller local time for about 5 minutes, okay, you can still able to access the domain. Okay, but if it is more than 5 minutes, it will be, you will not be able to access the domain. So this is one of the things also. So we can see all of these group policies, they are all important. Here we can see that renewal, this is also that we were talking about. The setting determines the period in days during the user tickets granting may be renewed. This security limits the amount of time an attacker has to crack the TGT and gain access. Anyway, we have discussed this for a couple of seconds. It's also 7 days. So this is done in the default domain policy, so it will be applied to all of the users or all of the computers and servers. Okay, so we have the maximum lifetime ticket renewal to be 7 days. Okay. And then we have the clock synchronization time. As I said before, he is saying here that determines the maximum time difference in minutes that Corpus will to relate between the time on a client clock and the time on the server clock. Here he means the domain controller, while still considering the two clocks synchronized. In order to prevent reply attacks, Corpus uses timestamps as a part of the protocol definition. Every process done by the Corpus to authenticate the user or authenticate the user rights to access a certain service or folder, this is done by a timestamp. So for example, the Corpus say that the user tried to authenticate to the domain in day number 15, for example, or day 15, month of so, and year and hour and time. This is very critical to how to audit or how to verify this. We need to use timestamps. Okay, so for timestamps to work properly, the clocks of the client and the server need to be in sync as much as possible. We have said this before. So your local time should be always synced as a machine with the domain controller's local time, because all of the processes done by the Corpus and other services on the Windows is completely attached to the time of the machine. Okay, so if the time is not correct, then we will have inaccurate data and inaccurate logs in the event logs concerning the access of different services, and even the problems happens to the machine. So the time is very, very critical to be always in sync, and you will not be able to access the domain unless your local time is in sync with the domain controller's local time. So we will see later that we can, or I have done this before, to make an NTP and sync the domain controller's local time with an external time server. Anyways, you go to the default domain controller and make sure that the maximum tolerance for synchronizing, okay, must be tolerance for synchronizing with domain controller must be 5 minutes. Permissions on Active Directory data files must only allow systems and administrators access. Okay, so we all know that the Active Directory has folders. Okay, 3 folders, important folders. One of them is the data, or something called NTDs. This is where all of the data of the Active Directory is stored. So all of the users, computers, groups, all of them are stored in a data folder called NTDs. And then we have another folder to save the logs of the Active Directory, and the third folder is to save the important group policies applied to the domain and the scripts applied to the domain, something called Sysvol. So we have Sysvol, and we have logs, and we have a folder for database. Okay, so he's saying that we need to make sure that the database of the Active Directory is only accessed by certain users, especially the systems and the local administrators on the domain controller. Improper access permissions for directory data related files could allow unauthorized users to read, modify, or delete directory data or audit trails. So we need to make sure that the ones to access the Active Directory database should be certain users, local administrators on the domain controller, and system or Windows system users. So how we can check this? We need to go to the regedit and check this kind of permissions. So let's see here. So for example, we go to the NTDs. This is the folder, and then we need to see the permissions on the NTDs. This is where the database of the Active Directory resides. Okay, so the Active Directory saves its database, or its users, groups, and computers, save them to a table or a database called, or it is in the folder called NTDs. Okay, so we can go to the command prompt and then issue a command to see who can access the NTDs folder. So we need to go to, we will go to the domain controller. Okay, and then we will Control Alt Delete and press OK, and then we can access by any user in the domain. This is a domain admin account, and then and then we need to navigate to the C Windows NTDs folder, and then issue a command to see who can access the Active Directory database. So let's wait and see how we can do this. So we need to go to C Windows NTDs and then issue a command to see. Here we say that if you will go to the command prompt and navigate to this folder and then issue a command to see who has access or permissions to this Active Directory database folder. This will be done through the command prompt. But if you see this from the registry, you need to check two keys in this path, the database log files path and the DSA database file. These two registry keys, we need to make sure through navigating to this path who have access to these two registry keys. Okay, anyway, so we will do this from two ways, from the registry or from the command prompt. But let's see first how we can do this from the command prompt. So we'll go to the sorry, we will go to first regedit and make sure to see the path is local machine system current control sets, system current control set services, I think, yes, services, and then we need to have NTDs services, not control, services services, okay, and then NTDs, and then parameters to see. So we do NTDs, yes, no, we can continue, okay, continue, okay, then NTDs, and then we need to see here, we can go a little bit further. Here we need to see the he's saying to see here two registry keys, I think, but it's not appearing correctly. This is NTDs, yes, and then we need to see something called database parameters. Yes, here we need to see something called database DSA database file. This is the location of the Active Directory database, and something called database, I think, log file. Let's see here what we need to check. We need to check the DSA database file. So this is the location of the database file of the Active Directory, okay, and this is also the log of the database. Okay, so we have two folders, one the database log file path and the other is the database file itself. So there is two things to be recorded, or the database file and the logs of the database. Okay, so we know the two locations. Now we can navigate through the command prompt to this folder and check the permissions on these two files. Okay, so we need to go. So we have now the location. Okay, so we know the location of the Active Directory database through the registry. So we now navigate to C Windows. Okay, first of all, this is not the correct answer. We need to tell him C or CD change directory to Windows / NTDs and press enter, and then we need to issue the command to see who has access to the NTDs. This contains the database. We have confirmed that the Active Directory database is in this location from the registry. Okay, so now we can go and check the permissions, who has permissions on the Active Directory database, and press enter. Now we can see every folder, or so here we can see that ntds.dit, this is the database of the Active Directory. Here we can see the only one that has access is the system and the administrator. So this is correct. This is in line with what the PDF says. So now we can see the different permissions for different users on different files in the NTDs folder. Okay, so we have 11 files. We need to concentrate on the ntds.dit. This is the database. Okay, so we have known the location of the database from the registry. Okay, so now this is correct. Now we can confirm that only system users and administrators have access to the Active Directory database. So this is one of the good things to know. And the next recommendation is to make sure that the Sysvol folder has proper access control permissions. What is the Sysvol? We can see this, or we can have a little bit of what is the Sysvol folder. This is a description of what is the Sysvol. So the Sysvol stores a domain's public files which are replicated to each domain controller. Okay, so what is Sysvol, or what is important, is a folder that exists on all domain controllers. It is the reciprocity for all of the Active Directory files. It stores all important elements of the Active Directory group policy. Okay, and not only this, it also stores the scripts used in the domain. Okay, so we can have another bit of detailed explanation. Okay, so here let's see here what he's saying here. Stores domain public files. The net login folder contains login scripts and group policies that can be used by computers deployed within a domain. So in Sysvol we have two things. We have the group policies that are applied to the domain and the scripts that are applied to the domain. Okay, so this is one of the things we need to make sure that the Sysvol folder is accessed by certain users. Here we can see that this is also another description. This is also one of the descriptions to say here. So here he says, okay, allow. So here it says will exist in all domain controllers a reciprocity or a location or storage for all the Active Directory files. It stores all the important elements of the Active Directory group policy. The File Replication Service, or FRS, allows the replication of the Sysvol folder among domain controllers, and this folder is replicated between all of the domain controllers, the primary and the additional. Okay, login scripts and policies are delivered to each domain user via Sysvol. So it is a location to store the important Active Directory group policies and the scripts. Okay, and these group policies and scripts are delivered and applied to the users through this Sysvol folder. Sysvol stores all the security related information of the Active Directory. So this is a lot of info we need to know about the Sysvol. So we need to make sure that certain users should access these folders and or proper access control permissions. Improper access permissions for the Active Directory data files could allow unauthorized users to read, modify, or delete. Anyway, he's saying here that Sysvol contains public files to a domain, such as policies and login scripts. Data is shared in shared subdirectories are replicated to all domain controllers. So the Sysvol folder is a very important folder, and it is replicated to all of the domain controllers. Here we need to see the share permissions on the Sysvol folder. Okay, by the way, this folder, it is shared in the domain, and all of the computers and users can able to access this folder to apply the different group policies and scripts to the users or computers. So you need to see the share permissions and see if they are in line with what is stated here in the PDF. So let's see, we can go to the command prompt and issue a command to see what are the different permissions on the Sysvol folder. So the Sysvol should be shared so the users can be able to access and apply different group policies and permissions, different group policies and scripts in the domain. Here we can see that I am accessing the domain controller and I access the shared folders on the domain controller, and here is the Sysvol. We can see its properties to see the permissions. So we can go to the properties and see share permissions. Here we can see that everyone has read. This is very, very convenient. And authenticated users, certain authenticated users, not all of them, will have full control, and the local administrators on the domain controller. So now we can see that these are the permissions, and this is a way that we can see the permissions, or we can see it from the command prompt. So we can go and navigate to the Sysvol folder through the command prompt and issue the command icalcs or icacls and see who has access to the Sysvol folder. And by the way, I didn't play with these permissions, so it is the default permissions. Okay, so all of these are to secure your Active Directory. Who has access to different elements or different parts of the Active Directory: database, the folders, the log folders, the database folders, all of these. So we can go to the domain controller through the command prompt and see also have access to these folders. Okay, you can go to see the security. Actually, this is also the security. So we have two permissions: share permissions and NTFS permissions. We need to check both. Okay, so we can see that all of these are in line with the PDF, but we will check also the permissions from the command prompt. We will not only use the graphical interface method, we will use the command prompt. So we can go and issue this command and tell him what are the permissions, and see these permissions and see if they are in line with the PDF. But they are. I didn't play with anything. So now we can check the permissions and see. So now this is correct. Now we need to see another thing here, that the group policy objects must have proper access control permissions. So the group policies in our domain, who has access to change the group policies? Okay, who has the access to read the group policies, to apply the group policies, to change the group policies, to delete the group policies, to whatsoever? Who has access to the group policy objects? Okay, the only one that can access or can change the group policy is the domain admins or the local administrators on the domain controller. So here we can see, we need to check this also. We need to see who can create, read or update or delete objects from the Active Directory, and one of these objects are the group policy. Okay, so the Active Directory or the group policy requires special attention. Okay, group objects are most likely to have access permissions changed from the secure defaults. If improper access permissions are denied or are defined for group policy objects, this could allow an intruder to change the security policy applied to all domain clients. Anyway, we need to make sure that the group policies are accessed and changed and updated by appropriate users or groups. Okay, so we can open the group policy management console. You have already opened it, and you will see review the permissions or the different group policy objects. Let's see how we can check this. So we can go to the group policy objects in the domain, and then for each group policy object we can open it or right click it and see delegation, and then advance and see who has access to this group policy. Any standard users or group should have allow to read, so users should have the read permission on different group policies. Okay, and apply. So a standard user should have the allow permission to read the group policy and apply the group policy. Okay, the change should be done or should be done by the local administrators or the domain admins. Okay, here we can see also in the advanced option that authenticated users, okay, so this is the standard. He mean by standard users, the authenticated users should have read and apply group policy only. She should have the read and apply. Okay, so we can check any one of the group policies in our domain and see if they have these rights or not. So we can have any one of these group policies, anyone, we can choose anyone and see, for example, right click any one of these group policy objects. So these are objects. Okay, and then not from here, we can need to see to edit. No, not from here actually. We need to check any one of these group policies, not from here, not from here. Okay, We need to check it from, okay, we can see the delegation. Here we can see that in the delegation tab, authenticated users have read, and this is good, and domain admins and enterprise admins and enterprise domain and system, all of these has different permissions. We need to check the authenticated users have only read and apply group policy. So this is also one of the things we need to make sure to see, and then we can go further through the permissions by advance and see what are the different things. Authenticated users also have read, so we can see different permissions. If we need to go further, we can check the advanced tab and see the different permissions, but actually now we are in line with the what the PDF says. Okay, every user have the correct permissions on the group policy. Okay, allow not greater than read and apply group policies. Okay, this is already there. So now we are in line with the PDF. So we can continue working and see. We can go to advance and see the other permissions. So now we can see that, for example, this is a group for generals. Okay, this will be applied to a certain group, and this group will only have read permission on the PDF on the group policy. So we need to check all of the group policies and who have the different permissions to access and apply these group policies. Okay, we need to check it. Okay, and if there is any differences or any users that should not have access or should not have these rights to access certain groups, group policy objects, we need to make sure. Okay, so here he is saying that the domain administrator will not have delete all child objects permissions on the default group policy. Anyway, so you need to check the permissions on the GPO or all of your group policy objects. Okay, then another thing is to make sure the domain controllers organizational units must have proper access. You need to check all of your Active Directory organizational units or folders and see who have the permissions to delete these organizational units, to update these organizational units, to rename these organizational units. So this is also one of the things we need to make sure: who can create organizational units, who can delete organizational units, who can read organizational units, update organizational units. All of this should be also done and checked. Okay, we need to make sure. I think this is the one that should have this only is the domain admins or the enterprise admins. Okay, so you need to review any one of your organizational units and see the security tab or properties, and then the security tab to see who have access to this organizational unit and what he can do. He can delete the organizational unit. He can, let's see here, for example, I need to get a little bit further here. So saying the domain controllers OU do not restrict changes to system, domain admins, enterprise admins, and administrators. Okay, if the permissions on domain controller OU do not restrict changes to system, domain admins, enterprise admin, and administrator, this is the finding. So let's see the permissions. Anyway, I didn't change these permissions, I leave them to the default. So this is only something to revise to see the default rights are there or not. So if we can change, or we can see the domain controller, this is the organizational unit that contains all of the domain controller servers. So we can tell him properties, and we can see the security. Okay, here we can see that you need to see that the domain admins, enterprise admins do not restrict changes. What we mean by do not restrict changes. So domain admin, he only has the read and write and create child objects. He cannot change it. Okay, he can read and write to it and create child object. This is the default permissions. I didn't play with it. Okay, so enterprise admins the same, I think. So we need to check the permissions and see. Okay, we need to view advance. Okay, so we need to view advance and see the different permissions. So we need to go to advance and see the permissions of different users and groups on the domain controllers OU. So we go to here, advance, and then we need to see, for example, we can see how domain admins will have special permissions. I think this is not it, or I don't have full control. So enterprise admins have full control, this is default. System have full control. Domain admins have special permissions. So we don't have a lot of things to do actually, and actually I didn't change these permissions, so we need just to revise it with the PDF and see if they are in line with what the PDF says. Okay, so we can continue working. I think here, so we can see here the different permissions. Okay, can continue working with it. So we can view or open any one of them and see the different permissions anyway, so we are ensured that we are in line with the what the PDF says, so we can continue working. Okay, and continue. Enterprise admins full control. So these are all listed. I didn't change any permissions, so these are in line with what the PDF says. We need only to revise the permissions. This is only to revise. Okay, if you didn't change anything when you install the Active Directory, you will see these permissions intact without change. Here we need to say also that the Active Directory organization unit objects must have proper access control permissions. So you need to check the domain controllers organizational unit in the Active Directory and see who has the different permissions on it, and all of the Active Directory organizational units, not only the domain controllers organizational units. You need to check every organizational unit in your Active Directory and who has access to it, who can change it, who can delete it, who can create objects in it or child objects in it. So this is our all regular check to see. Okay, so this is also one of the things we need to make sure to check. Okay, the different permissions. You can open something called advanced features in the Active Directory to see more details. Okay, who access the organizational unit, and we can check the security tab and see the different permissions for different users on different Active Directory organizational units. Okay, so this is, we can go to view, not from here. Okay, so we need to, if we need to display more data, okay, so for example here we need to tell him view and advanced features to see more data. So for example, if we go to the ally organizational unit and properties and then security, here we can see who have access to this organizational unit. What can he do? Go to advanced, and then we can see different groups and different permissions, okay, for these groups on the organizational unit in the Active Directory. Okay, so here I have the IT to have full control. This is a group to have full control over all of the Active Directory organizational units. Okay, so here we see the different permissions for the different groups and users. So this is correct. We need to check this and continue. And then the next recommendation, data files owned by users must be on a different logical partition from the directory service data files. So here is saying that you should not, from my perspective, to share folders on the domain controller. Okay, from my permission, if you need to not to only share folders on the domain controller, but if you make a file server and you need to share folders that users can access, do not share the folders on the system partition. So if you have a file server, you need to have two partitions, one for the system, and do not share any folders on it, and the other one is for the data partition, or you can put folders on it and share it to the users. He is saying that you should not share folders on the partition that contains the directory server data files. So here, for example, if you are talking about the domain controller, you should not share folders on the partition, share folder for users on the partition that contains the Active Directory folders or data. This should not be done. Okay, but as for me, I prefer not to share any folders on the domain controller. Okay, but if you will do, do not share folders on the partition that hosts the Active Directory folders. So for example, we have the NTDs folder, the Sysvol folder, the log folders. All of these are in C Windows NTDs, okay, in the partition C. If you need to share any folder on the C partition, do not do this. Share it on a D partition, for example, and give it to the users. Okay, so do not share any folders on the same partition that hosts the Active Directory folders or that contains the directory server data files. Okay, so this is one of the things also we need to concentrate on. The directory service may be vulnerable to denial of attack service attack when a user-owned files on a common partition are expanded to an extent prevented the directory service from acquiring more space for directory or audit data. Anyway, so we need to make sure, okay, that no one will share folders on the C partition that contains the Active Directory data. Anyway, this we have already checked. We have seen that there is only the Sysvol folder that is shared on the C partition, okay, and the other is for the system. No specific custom user folders are shared on the domain controller. And another very important recommendation: the domain controller must run on a machine dedicated to that function. So you should dedicate a whole server to be a domain controller. Do not put any other services or server roles on this machine. So the only server role that will be running on the server is the domain controller. So you dedicate a server and run the server role domain controller on it, and no other server role should be run. So for example, if you have a domain controller, you should not run file server on the same server. So you should not have a server that is running as a domain controller as a file server and as a file server or as a DHCP. So you should have a complete server to be dedicated to run as a domain controller. Okay, so this is one of the things also we need to concentrate on. Okay. We're saying here, executing application servers on the same host machine with a direct directory server may substantially weaken the security of the directory server. So, for example, if you are running a domain controller on a server and the same server is hosting a web server, for example, this will loosen or it will affect the security of the Active Directory or the domain controller. So, web or database server applications usually require the addition of many programs and accounts, increasing the attack surface of the computer. So you should not run a web server or database server on the same server that is running a domain controller. Okay, some applications require the addition of privileged accounts, providing potential sources of compromise. Some applications such as Microsoft Exchange may require the use of network ports or services conflicting with the directory service. In this case, non-standard ports might be selected, and this could interfere with the intrusion detection or prevention services. So this is very logical thing. We all, or as an IT, I always, or all of the professional ITs always say that the domain controller should run separately on a server without any other services running beside it. Okay, we can see this clearly by see the server roles or see the server roles and services on the server. We can run a certain command to see this, or we can see the program and features and see what are the roles and features put on the domain controller. Okay, so this is one of the best recommendations until now, and this is a default one. The next recommendation: Windows Server 2019 must use separate NSA approved cryptography to protect the directory data in transit from directory service implementations at a classified confidentiality level when replication data traverse a network cleared to a lower level than the data. Anyway, He's saying I think the encryption should be applied when you are having I think different domain and child domains. Okay, so let's see the description of this recommendation. Data directory. Okay, let's see here. Data directory means the Active Directory data is not appropriately encrypted, is subject to compromise. So we need to encrypt the Active Directory data. Commercial grade encryption does not provide adequate protection when the classification level of the directory data in transit is higher than the level of the network. Anyway, he's saying that you need to encrypt the Active Directory data. How this is done? This is done using some type of cryptography. Okay, so he's saying that review the organizational network diagram or document to determine the level of classification for the network over which replication data is transmitted. So I think he is concentrating on protecting the Active Directory data and protect the Active Directory data in transit or in transmission to the other, I think, additional domain controllers. So he's saying here we need to encrypt the transition of data between domain controllers and the Active Directory data itself. Okay, I think this is done using cryptography anyway. He's saying that, but I don't know how this will be done. The other recommendation: Windows Server 2019 directory data outside the root DSE of a non-public directory must be configured to prevent anonymous access. To the extent that anonymous access to directory data outside the root DSE is permitted, read access control of the data is effectively disabled. If other means of controlling access such as network restriction are compromised, this may be nothing else to protect the confidentiality of sensitive directory data. So anyone outside of the Active Directory from another domain, for example, should not have access to our domain. What is called anonymous access. We have discussed this before, that we need to not give anonymous access to our Active Directory, okay, or domain from other domains outside unless there is a trust relationship. Anyway, I think this is talking about. So also we can see the recommendations. So I think we need to see here something. Connection simple bind anonymous user. So I think here we need to, first of all, what is DSE? Let me see something here. I need to see something here, guys. Just a minute, so we can continue working and see here what he's talking about. Sysvol, okay, and okay, proper access, special permissions, and we can go further. Data owned, domain controllers, okay, cryptography, and then let's see what we mean by DSE. I think it is domain service. I think what is DSE? Display screen equipment? No. Domain, I think. DS, it means domain specific design. Okay, I think this is talking about domain specific design. So outside of the root, domain specific design. Okay, so he's talking about accessing the domain from outside. Okay, so we need to make sure here that no one outside of our domain can access our domain unless there is a trust. Okay, if there is no trust, there is an option called anonymous access. So anyone outside our domain, if the anonymous access option is enabled, he can access and read from our domain. So how we can check? We need to go and open a command prompt and run this command and check the connection menu and see something called bind, and then clear username, password, domain field, select simple bind. Okay, confirmation of anonymous will be displayed at the end. Anonymous login. So in the search tab, anyway, so I think he is saying that we will not need to let anonymous users access our domain from outside. Okay, and then we have the Windows Server directory 7 must be configured to terminate LDAP based network connections to directory server after 5 minutes of inactivity. Okay, the failure to terminate inactive network connections increase the risk of successful attack on the Active Directory. Anyway, this is something. So what is LDAP? We can see. So he's saying that we need to, what is LDAP? LDAP it is, okay, let's see what is LDAP. LDAP, it is a protocol that makes it possible for applications to query user information rapidly. So this is a protocol that is used to query data from the Active Directory. Okay, so he's saying here, what is saying here? He's saying that we need to terminate access to the Active Directory to query for certain data or certain info if there is an inactivity for 5 minutes. So for example, if you have an application that uses the LDAP to query the Active Directory for data about certain users or groups, you should terminate the connection to the Active Directory if the application is not working for 5 minutes. He is saying that directory server was configured to terminate LDAP based network connections to the directory server after 5 minutes of inactivity. So for example, if you open an application that uses the LDAP to query the Active Directory for certain information on certain users and groups, you worked on this application, okay, and then you left it for 5 minutes without activity, then the connection to the Active Directory should be terminated. The query for the Active Directory should be terminated. Okay, so this is one of the things also need to see here. And how we can know this? We can issue a command from the command prompt NTDs util, and then we need to tell him LDAP policies, LDAP policy connections, and then prompt for the connection server. Okay, so here policy, then connections, then we need to type the connection or type the server or the name of the domain controller, and then we need to type something called Q and see the LDAP policy show values. Okay, if the maximum value is greater than 300 or 5 minutes, it's not specified. This is a finding. So here is saying that we need to make sure that the LDAP values, okay, is 300 or 5 minutes. Okay, so this is also one of the things we need to see, or we need to make sure. Okay, and the other recommendation is to Active Directory group policy objects must be configured with appropriate audit settings. So we need to make sure that the group policy objects that users should certain users should access these group policy objects to change it or delete it or what's and so, and who is also the appropriate users to audit the group policy. Okay, with proper audit setting. Okay, we must be configured with proper audit. Sorry guys, you need to make some audit policies to monitor the changes in the group policies objects. We have done this before also, to make audit to the changes to the group policies. Okay, we need to audit who are the users that are changing the group policy. Okay, so he is saying that inappropriate audit settings are configured for directory service database object. It may be possible for a user or a process to update the data without generating any tracking data. So we need to make sure that the appropriate group or audit objects should be in place. Okay, so here we need to see the auditing tab on any group policy object and see what we need to audit. We need to audit the fail type fail. We need to audit everyone. So he's saying the audit setting for any group object are not at least as inclusive as below. This is a finding. Type is fail, principal everyone, access full control applies to this object and all descendant objects. Anyway, so we need to make sure who that we can audit our group policies objects carefully. Okay, we can see here is the fail and there is the success. Okay, anyway, so we need to check and see this, and we need, this is done at configure the audit policy for group audit to include the following. This can be done at the policy. Anyway, so we need to audit the group policy objects. This is done, and the domain objects should be audited also. So we need to audit the group policy objects, or to have the different audit options on the group policy object and all of the domain or the Active Directory objects. We need also to see if this is done also correctly or not. We need to see this. You need to read the PDF and see the different audit options on the different Active Directory objects. Okay, so I think we need to, let's go further and see where we have stopped here in the infrastructure. So we can go further, NTDs, okay, and then infrastructure. So we are here. We need also to have the appropriate audit setting for the infrastructure objects. What are the infrastructure objects? So we need to go to the Active Directory, users and computers, advanced features, and then right click something called infrastructure security and see the different audit options for this infrastructure objects. Okay, here we need to see the domain controllers organization unit must be configured with proper audit setting. Okay, so all of these are related to the audit setting for different Active Directory objects. We need to make sure that we can audit different Active Directory objects. Okay, we need to check the audit setting for all of these. Okay, so this is done already. We can check all of these. So, and I think, let's see how, if you have stopped at this one, so we can go and continue working. So here we can check, just a minute. So this is I think for the infrastructure. Let's see here. So this is also all related to the audit options for the Active Directory or different Active Directory objects. So we can go to right click and properties. This is for the infrastructure. So properties, and then we can see something called domain infrastructure. Okay, and properties and security, and then advanced, and see the auditing. Okay, so security and then advanced, and then we can see the auditing here. This is the one. So we here, for example, this is for the red alert domain. We can see that we audit everyone, success everyone, success domain users, success. So we can audit all of these. So this is one of the things we need to audit, or have different audit options for different users and groups in the Active Directory, or to audit different objects in the Active Directory. So this is the domain controller. We need to make sure that the audit options for the domain controller OU, this is also, we can check it from the properties of the OU. Okay, so we can do this. This is our all routine things to do. Okay, and then there is a folder in the Active Directory called admin SD folder. admin SD holder object must be configured with proper audit setting. What is admin SD holder folder? Okay, admin SD folder is a container in NTD that holds the security descriptor applied to members of protected groups. What is this one? Let's continue here. So no, what did admin SD holder that acts as security descriptor template for protected accounts and groups in Active Directory. In other words, admin object enables users to manage access control list of members. I think this is not also something to say. Anyway, so this is an important folder in the Active Directory. We need also to check if there is proper audit to this folder. Okay, so this is one of the things. We will stop at this recommendation and continue the other time. So we'll continue working in the video number 12. Hope this was informative for you all, and thank you all for viewing. Thank you so much.